Hi everyone, and welcome to Mind the Shift. The name of this podcast is a play with words that refers to a notion of a real shift happening in the world, a shift strongly connected to the fact that humanity is integrating in a way that has never happened before in history. But it also refers to a shift in the way our minds perceive our world and our reality. One theme that I've been spending a lot of time pondering, analyzing, and also writing about is something I call the cozy darkness of the apocalypse. Now, what kind of a strange concept is that? Well, it's the fact that we have a hard time acknowledging progress, no matter in what field, and that we tend to focus on the few bad things that happen and forget the many good things that happen all the time. There are a number of reasons why we function in this way, and I intend to talk more about that in this podcast. In this episode, we're going to look closer into one particular aspect of human development, one that is discussed a lot and considered extremely important: democracy. My two guests, Professor of Political Science Mikael Sandberg at the University of Halmstad in Sweden, and independent political science researcher Max Rånge, are working with something quite remarkable. They're developing the largest and probably most reliable data set on political systems in the world. Max is the creator. Let's hear him explain how it all started.
I started around 17 years ago now, I believe. And I have developed institutional data for institutions and level of democracy to all countries and every month since 1789, and all states and years since 1600.
All states and all years?
Yes.
That sounds like a truly Herculean task.
That has
Is it
been
even possible?
It's a life work the past 15 years or so.
Yeah, I must say.
So, and I developed this very much my own, based on my interest and my academic background in political science. And then after a few years, I get in contact with Mikael, firstly from a radio program I believe he was part in, and I contacted him. And from there on, we had begun to develop even more this data in order to function as a academic tool for political science purposes. And this has ever since been even further developed by new variables such as ideology. And
yeah, we're going to come back to that a little bit, or a lot, I guess.
And this,
how to compare this your work with other institutions' work and different ways of looking at democracy. Maybe if we look a little bit closer at these seven criteria, if we a little bit more deeply, we start with number one, territorial control. That sounds, to me, that doesn't sound like a criterion for democracy, but
to any government, it is necessary for the government or regime to have control over its territory in order to be a democracy. For instance, you can have a government that is truly, in a basic sense, democratic, but if it doesn't have territorial control, then it doesn't affect the whole country. So that's a fundamental criteria, I believe.
I guess that's something you seldom think about. Have you got a good example of that, historical or?
One example is present? Iraq, that were basically democratic since 2006. But during the early years of the ISIS domination from the invasion from 2014 and forward, one could consider the government being not in control of sufficient territory to be democratic.
That's true.
And in some sense, you can say the same thing about Afghanistan for some years.
That
where the
what do you
government,
mean? That Afghanistan was in many respects a democracy, but it didn't have control over its territory. Is that what you're saying?
it may have had some, it may have fulfilled some basic criteria for at least electoral democracy. But if they're not in sufficient control of territory of Afghanistan, then it will it will be hard for them to qualify as a democracy.
Okay, so what about number 2? That sounds more straightforward for someone who's
Political competition. Yes.
Political competition. Yes. Tell us a little bit more about that.
That's one of the most fundamental criteria is that there should be at least 2 or more good political alternatives in an election or in the political society in order to function as a democracy. And I believe that would be even more important criteria than several other, because in a broader sense, one could consider Great Britain as electoral or weak democracy even back to the 1783, simply because they had a good political competition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Party, even though they have lacked some other criteria for in the suffrage or in the and so on, and political rights. It's simply because they had a good political competition between the parties, and will need one of them having an obvious advantage in the elections, which, even though not perfectly.
Otherwise, they didn't have all things in place.
And they did have a frequent shift of government and regimes over the years as well.
Gladstone and Disraeli.
What? Yeah,
Gladstone and Disraeli in the 19th century. Yeah.
And in other countries where.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Okay, number 3. I was just continuing here on the list.
Yeah, okay.
Freedom of speech and media and assembly. That sounds also like something that's pretty natural to ask for, and it's also something that is very much in focus these days, don't you think? When people talk about democracy.
Yes, that's. I agree there. It is very much. It's very much criteria that is necessary for at least good political accountability. I mean that even though a government could have been a popular legitimacy and have been representing the actual will of the people, but by at least correct elections without apparent fraud. Still, if there is not a good free media or freedom of expression, there is not sufficiently good political accountability. In order
then you have a criterion which is a little bit less straightforward, I guess, a little bit less easy to understand what it's about. It's called electoral integrity and quality. What do you mean by that?
That is simply the electoral procedures, that they shall both be free, correct, and under a secret vote.
Okay, I see.
Basically.
And number 5 is constitutional consensus. Is that
this one? This is basically, it's about one thing that is quite crucial for a stable democracy, such as the political alternatives. Even though disputing about political issues, they still have some kind of democratic respect for one another. And they will still, after finished and correct elections, they will have enough respect to consider the winning party legitimate.
Okay, like for instance, what's been happening in a few countries in Africa with formerly no long traditions of democracy, like in Nigeria, when Goodluck Jonathan stepped down and gave room for Buhari. That's an example of that, is it?
That is an example of improved.
Improved number 5 criteria.
That is one that has some.
Mm-hmm. And then number 6.
But also there you can say that if there is if an election is considered free and fair, or a constitutional consensus could also be the fact that if the losing party in the election doesn't recognize the winners as correctly, as being so correctly.
Can I ask
yes, Mikael.
Yes, I associate it with the problem Ukraine has had for a long time now, that the eastern parts really have a population in which in reality is not really accepting the constitution of Ukraine. They still think they belong to Russia, even if they live in the territory of Ukraine.
That is one aspect, yes.
Yeah, just to add to this discussion.
Yeah. Number 6, general suffrage. That's something that you hear many times from countries that you consider being dictatorships, really, because they force their population to go out and vote for the one and only leader. So what about general suffrage? How important is that?
Well, that is important. Of course, it's in order to consider a country democratic, it is important and necessary to have a broad electoral suffrage with equal vote. But
I was just teasing a little bit, but
okay, I'm sorry. But still, it's not one of the most important, because when comparing to political competition, for instance, I would say that a country with limitations in general suffrage, like Britain in the 19th century, if you compare that to the Soviet Union in the 20th century, Soviet Union had a general suffrage but without a good political competition or criteria that are more important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about countries that are democratic but have mandatory suffrage that you have to
Yeah, I see, like Belgium for you.
Belgium, Greece, I think. Yeah. What about those countries?
Well, in that aspect, I haven't really taken that into account there.
Okay.
I wouldn't consider them more democratic. I wouldn't consider them less democratic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and then we have number 7, which is constitutional order. Sounds pretty heavy.
That are related to institutional functions in the society, and the balance of power between parliament and executive, for instance.
Yeah. Okay.
I would say
so. And these are the 7 criteria that are needed in your analysis here, and
in order to be a qualified democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Sufficient standards in all these is needed.
Yeah. Okay.
And then to what extent you're lacking in either of them, you will be in a other level of democracy.
So how do you go about when you list countries in order to tell whether they are democratic or not? How do you go about doing this? How do you weigh these criteria, for instance, and how does that differ from how other institutions and databases go about doing it?
Well, I would say that looking at, as I said, in order to be a qualified democracy, you have to fulfill all criteria. And if you fulfill the most important, but lacking in a little less important, you could be at least be a weaker electoral democracy.
I understand you have a system of you have a grading from 0 to 100, is it, or
0 to in one of our scales? Yes, we have a even more detailed scale.
Okay, well. up to what?
1,000, but in 200.
1,000. Okay, that sounds really detailed.
So far,
very
it's
ambitious.
200. It's under progress to be
Okay.
So
that's
far 200 done.
That's the basis for this then. Well, we can let in Mikael here and hear what he has to say about these criteria and how you have been able to use this Max's work in your research.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a fascinating data set, of course, and it's a creation of Max's that is, I mean, it's so huge project he endeavored to take on when he was 50 years younger than today. It's amazing. Nobody would even dare or think of doing this, and it was almost the case that I doubted his work in the beginning when he took contact with me, because I was doing research together with people, the researchers from Stockholm, and we used the standard American data sets that are available on the net freely. But these are quite different from Max's. The basic difference is that Max uses a categorical scale, that is, each value on his special index indicates a yes or no to a certain element or component or institution of that regime, while in other databases, normally you have simply a scale from 0 to 1 or 0 to 10 or something like that, without really indicating what it contains in reality as regime type. So it's in essence.
What is the problem with that, really?
It's well, there are problems in the sense that it's more difficult statistically to use it, because normally you if you use statistical analysis, you prefer often scales from 1 to 0 or 1 to 0 to 1 to 1, 0 to 10, 0 to 100, and so forth, because it makes it easier statistically to find to measure associations between variables, as we say. Okay. But in Max's case, you have categorical values, but it's actually I think it's correct, but it is more demanding in a sense, because then you have to use other methods too. On the other hand, once you do that, you discover more interesting patterns in results. So it's in fact has greater scientific potential. So it's amazing that it exists, and I really am impressed by his work.
So this data set, which is called Max Range, by the way, that's how you pronounce it in English, and it's a play of words with Max's name, Max Rånge, which spells Max Range in English. Would you say, Mikael, and also Max, that this is the most ambitious data set about regimes and political systems in the world ever created?
Yes, I would say so.
About regimes, at least, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, if you think in terms of describing the details of each regime, definitely yes. There are other data sets, but they are more abstract, which means that once you find relationships between values, you cannot really relate that to what it means in practice to each country and year.
Wow, this is amazing. I mean, has Max and you and this database gotten the acknowledgement that it should as yet? do researchers know about this in the United States, for instance, and Europe?
Best. Well, we do our best, but it's not that easy always to be recognized. I think it partly depends on, I don't know what you say here, Max, but I think it's difficult in a small country in Europe to find additional sources for supporting this research when other databases also exist, compared to if we were doing research in the United States or in Germany. Or
would you get funding in a different way if you were to research about this in the United States?
I mean,
More likely.
Likely.
Yes, I do think it's a huge difference in plurality, both in terms of sources and groups of researchers within the same field. We tend to be avoiding competition between researchers, and once one group is financed, you seldom find that a competing group also gets funding.
So you don't want to get a second opinion here in Sweden.
No,
when it comes to research.
So that's what I think. I once called Max the Linnaeus of political institutions.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like it, actually. It's really amazing. I mean, I've seen some when I have been working at the newspaper Dagens Nyheter. We have talked before, and I've written articles about this work. So I've looked into it a little bit, but it's really huge, and it's really impressive to see to what detail you can pinpoint the democratic development in all these countries. It really has to be seen. It's difficult to convey this in a podcast like this, but we can. I
believe you only have seen the yearly data. I would like to emphasize that in the full data, it's on a monthly.
Yeah,
it's on a monthly basis.
Yeah, so that's totally unique. You know, you can only find yearly data otherwise, but this is monthly.
That's true. That's what you often hear. Yeah,
got into the details of that yet, but so yeah,
it's really amazing. It's incredible. So hopefully this will spread a little bit more, and the knowledge of this data set will spread a little bit more through this podcast and through other sources. Of course, I will surely try and do that. So let's get a little bit more into the quality of this, what it means on the ground, so to speak, and what has been going on, what has happened in the world, democracy-wise, because you hear many things about this. Briefly, you could say that democracy, of course, spread very fast during the latter half of the last century. We all know about that, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But then recently, last maybe 5 or 10 years, there have been a lot of discussions about setbacks. Renowned other databases and institutions like Freedom House, very heavy institution in the United States, and the European Intelligence Unit, which also publishes work about where democracy is going every year. They have repeatedly reported about these setbacks, as they say, sometimes described as alarming. And it has become almost, you could say, the general picture today. No one, especially not in the media, really questions that there is a backward trend. But I know that you criticize this narrative to some degree, or to a large degree maybe. So why are these other institutions wrong?
To some degree, I would say yes. We would agree that there is, if we look at a few different levels of democracy, there is a degradation of the number of qualified and strong democracies in the world. Mm-hmm. But when looking at these, most of them transfers to a weaker electoral democracy rather than going to authoritarianism. And even though others may focus on the authoritarianism trends, most countries are still remain democratic in the basic sense.
So what they are talking about is more about
standard on the democracy. other institutions like Freedom House has very high standards for being a democracy. Basically matching what the Max Range call qualified democracy.
Mm.
And
is that a problem? Is that a problem that you have high standards?
The problem is that countries that doesn't fulfill criteria of qualified democracy could still be democratic if they have, according to us, if they are fulfilling the formal criteria of electoral quality and political competition and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And that you should distinguish from countries that are not democratic, that Freedom House calls partly free. Their category of partly free often combines the countries that are in basic sense democratic with sufficiently enough credible elections and political competitions. And they're combining those with countries that are not fulfilling democratic criteria at all.
Mm.
And then if you're measuring the number of countries that are actually democratic in a broader sense, there is no visible setback in the number of democratic states. And also, if you widen out the objectives a bit and look at the number of authoritarian states in the world, there has been a clear progress of leading to fewer authoritarian states over even the last decade.
Okay, so the number of authoritarian states has declined,
yes,
undoubtedly. And the number of democracies in general terms has increased, undoubtedly.
Those are basically about the same, I would say.
About the same since when? Since 10 years ago?
If you compare 10, 15 years ago.
Okay. But on the top level, talking about the qualified democracies, the very top,
the strong democracies, yes.
Tier, the strong democracies.
Yes.
There you have seen some kind of setbacks. Is that correct?
We have seen significant setback, yes.
Okay.
But not as dramatic as others may say. I would rather say it has faded out the last years.
Mm-hmm. So what the discussion is about then, maybe you can come in here also, Mikael, is that they are I'm not, this is my words, not yours, but they are perhaps exaggerating the backward trend by focusing only on these highly qualified democracies and what's happening there, and talking almost nothing about what's going on the tiers that are a bit lower down on the scale, so to speak. They're not looking at all on the countries that are lifting themselves up from authoritarianism up to weak democracies and so on. Is that what's happening?
Yes, I would say.
I
basic sense.
I cannot show that on the screen now, but there was a peak in the qualified democracies in 2006, and I think I can see here that it was 117 at that point, and then now this year we have 88, so it means a decline from the peak 2006. On the other hand, the electoral democracies increased in number. So last year we had 57, and this year 54, as far as I can see now. And we have a slight increase in so-called false democracies.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what I can.
And false democracies is what I would call a country that is neither authoritarian or democratic.
Mm-hmm.
Several other make a clear black and white picture of authoritarian states and democratic. And I believe it's important to also have a focus on countries that are neither. And that many countries and many failing democracies doesn't go to authoritarianism if
that's an interesting question also.
They could go to intermediate false democracy level.
Mm-hmm.
And many authoritarian states, before they go to democratic states, they could stop at the false democratic level.
Yeah.
And most countries that do so doesn't retreat in authoritarianism in the next step they will thereafter be democratic. So I believe it's important to have an intermediate step between authoritarianism and democratic states.
Okay, yeah, we should explain to the audience also that you not only have these 7 basic criteria, but you also have these different levels of democracy, which you have labeled you have different names for the best democracy and the worst, so to speak. Can you just briefly say which they are? I think there are 5 or 6 levels.
There are 5 basic levels, I would say.
5 basic. So let's take the basics.
Those are the qualified democracy.
Yeah.
And a weak electoral democracy, which is also democratic. Democratic, but doesn't fulfill the high standards like the qualified democracy. And below that, we have the false democracy, countries that have some political competition and, in a broader sense, as some functioning political society and opposition, but it's not authoritarian. And authoritarian states,
number 4,
is the level below.
Yeah.
And authoritarian states are divided into what I would call a basic authoritarianism and despotism. And these are distinguished basically on how decentralized the power is. Where despotisms are very much a dictatorship under a leader or a government very much in control of. It's very much a dictatorship, even where compared to basic autocracy or a general level of authoritarianism, where you can where the power very lies more in the party, in one party or in a parliament. Which still has some political accountability to the government.
Despotism is the regime type that was dominant several hundred years ago, I guess. That was the type of there were maybe 1 or 2 countries that didn't have it.
That was very dominant, yes, up to about 100 years ago, I'd say.
Yeah, and so today, would you say how many countries would you describe as despotisms today?
Those are shrinking in numbers, I would say. It's something around 18, 19, I would say, today.
18 or 19?
Yeah.
So countries like Eritrea, North Korea, is that correct?
Good examples, yes, and Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia as well.
Qatar, United Arab Emirates.
Okay.
More like
so many
those countries are very much despotic.
Okay. So to be a little bit topical here, when we record this episode, there has recently been a presidential election in Poland, and the incumbent from the ruling party, PIS, Andrzej Duda, which can his party can be described as, if not authoritarian, I guess at least nationalist. He prevailed in this election, and this is seen as a problem for democracy when you read about it in the papers. And you hear similar worries concerning Hungary as well. And both those countries are members of the European Union, which is supposed to be the beacon of democracy. So what is your take on the Polish and the Hungarian situation, which is interesting and very topical right now?
Well, yes, I would say that naturally, of course, there are democratic shortages in both Poland and Hungary, even though I believe Hungary, since the latest election, has, as a result of lacking political accountability and free media, has landed on below the democratic level. And is today considered a false democracy, which doesn't fulfill even standard for weak electoral democracy, which I still believe Poland is.
Poland is still a qualified democracy, or
not.
No, it's not at the top tier.
It's weak electoral democracy.
Okay,
I would say it's still even though they have judicial reforms that can be criticized by all rights. One should also acknowledge that the elections are basically free, and there is a quite vibrant opposition party that can fulfill its role, unlike in Hungary, where the opposition is very weak. In Poland, there is a quite strong opposition, which we saw in the elections with a civic platform having almost 50% in the vote.
But what is it in Poland that has made that country slip down on the scale? Is it what they have done to the judiciary?
I would
mainly?
say so, yes.
Okay.
But I wouldn't say that those reforms are an imminent threat of authoritarianism. I would say that it will not be a good and prosperous democracy with those kind of reforms. But thanks to a strong and vibrant opposition and quite overall clean elections, and thanks to the actual democratic legitimacy of the elections, I would say that Poland is still a democracy. And
what is your take?
And what I believe, besides the judiciary and the media situation, one should not take into account ideological perspectives when measuring a democracy. I believe for as long as there is enough space for freedom of speech and political opposition, on the ideological sense, like a nationalist rhetoric, is not an aspect of democracy, at least for a higher criteria.
Do you think an institution like Freedom House, very renowned, very well known, does a little bit of that when they, for instance, they have a very much more coarse definition of democracy? They have basically three levels, and they, for instance, they put North Korea in the same category as Russia, which is to me a bit odd.
I would say that is one of their main problematic methodological problems with Freedom House.
Yeah,
since they have emphasized too much, even though they are right to do it in some aspect, but they emphasize too much on the civil rights and the content and nature of political decisions, which might have an effect on the qualified democracy, one may say, but when comparing that to formal criteria like political competition or electoral quality and so on, civic right and civil rights should be secondary. And I believe that over the years, they have begun to emphasize even more on those criteria. And that leads to a historical imbalance, since they judge present states harder than
difficult to compare historically then.
15, 20 years ago, when they didn't have those.
Oh, that's also a reason why it looks worse than it is, maybe. The slide looks steeper than it actually is.
If they judge countries today harder in the civil rights criteria than they did 15, 20 years ago. And then you would believe, it would appear that countries today are more authoritarian or less democratic than before, even though there is maybe no real difference.
Fascinating. Do you have a take on this, Mikael, also?
Yes, I agree with Max that it's important to distinguish between democracy as a method of political decision-making and political communication, and its content in terms of civil rights, tolerance, certain values, etc. It's important to see that if the system works as such, that is, if winning parties do actually form government, you shouldn't judge the resulting regime from its ideology or content, in fact. And it's an old, I could trace this to both professor at Harvard, Joseph Schumpeter, and also to our own legendary political scientist Herbert Tingstein, who echoes the same idea. Democracy has no content. It's a method of making political decisions on the basis of many people's votes. It's as simple as that. But nowadays, you tend to think of the content before you think of the system as a machinery for making political decisions. And
is that also the reason behind the polarization that we're seeing right now?
Yes, I think by means of social media and etc., you can somehow find the weak points of democracy by certain injections of poison, and win power by means that were not even thought of when democracy in its original mechanisms was constructed. I mean, basically, democracy was founded when we only had newspapers. And nowadays, with social media, there's a totally different political communication environment for democracy. And it hasn't really responded to that threat yet. Maybe we come to that, but I think democracy in the future will have to deter threats from polarization and social media somehow, because it can find weaknesses in the construction and exploit them. Mass movements can be very dangerous. I mean, we saw that in Germany in the 30s, but the same thing can apply today by means of social media, I think, actually.
You think so? You think that even in a world where people are more educated than ever and more informed than ever, know more about the world than ever, know more about the conditions in other places of the world than ever, that it still could deteriorate like that?
Yeah. I mean, humans are also social animals, so they tend to like friends. They like what friends say they like. So you like before you even think. You look at a tweet or a message posted, and you like it because the person who posted it is a friend of yours, not because of the content. So, I mean, normally democracy should be based, I think, on your own critical thinking of what is the things in society you could change by means of politics. Nowadays, people tend to like whatever their friends like. Suddenly, you get avalanches of activism that may have a attractive cause, but still may threaten the stability of a rather sensitive mechanism. Democracy. So, I mean, but maybe that could be a topic for discussion.
Yeah, very, very much so. We can delve a little bit into that if you want to. I mean, there's not only the social media thing that you're talking about here. We have also lately seen many protests in the streets all over the world, both in countries we denominate as democracies and in authoritarian countries. Can you sense, or could you see that we are in some way seeing a transformation or evolution of democracy, that it's going someplace else? Maybe we're done with the 1789 construction of democracy and we need something different.
I think the basic idea is good, but as every good system, it can be exploited by threats, and this is a threat. There is a threat of new communication systems that were not even thought of when we invented the type of democracy we have today. So that's one problem. We have to deal with that somehow, and probably globally. I'm not sure I think this is a national problem,
No.
rather a global problem. So maybe we should have some kind of global authority controlling what is really happening on the internet or in social media.
You said the words control and authority. That doesn't sound very democratic in my ears.
Yeah, no, but not control.
The paradox.
Not control for a certain purpose, but to regulate.
Surveillance.
Rather.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Not survey. I don't. I'm not speaking in favor of surveillance, but from regulation.
Okay, regulation. Yeah, I understand.
Also, since we have companies like Facebook and Twitter that are private corporations, that is a problem if you have them controlling communication, which in fact is a matter for the public sphere. The problem is also you have so many public spheres now instead of one. So one group of people don't know what is going on in the other sphere. So we divide ourselves in little tribes that think alike together, but different in between. So it's fragmentation.
Some people do. I'm not convinced that goes for the general public actually, but I know that there are some tribes.
Yeah. No, but I realize that we have to be careful in the future with what we accept as means for political communication. That's
but maybe what's starting here could be some initiation of transformation of democracy that we don't know as yet where it's going to lead. But maybe there is something happening. I mean, just the two basic things that we're so used to them that we don't even think about it. That democracy has to be based in the nation state, and we elect our leaders in the nation state. And the second one being that we have leaders at all. I mean, we need to have parties. We need to have leaders that lead us, and we choose them in the nation state. I mean, what if that is not a given? I mean, if you look 50 years from now, is it? Could it be that there's some other kind of type of ruling countries, maybe more collectively? I don't know. Maybe organizations. I don't know. Maybe having administrators and inspirers, but not leaders. It's a philosophical thought, but why not?
Difficult to say, but based on historical experiences, one could expect 50 years is a very long period, but compared today with 50 years ago, the institutional basics of a political system is very much the same. And even though technological progress could perhaps change that in some aspect, it is difficult to see how that would
change.
How that would work in a proper democratic system where each person's vote is worded the same and not dependent on how well you are organized on.
I can get the sense, this is a little bit more philosophical again, but I can get the sense sometimes when I speak to people about what they think of politicians and the leadership of their country and other countries, that they kind of feel that they long for independence, more independence, and that they can think by themselves. They don't need these leaders. I mean, you know very well about this thing of contempt for politicians, which could be a bad thing, of course, but it could also be that people don't say yes and amen to everything that politicians say today, which they might have done 50 years ago when their families had always voted for the Social Democrats or the moderates in Sweden, in this case of Sweden, and so they did that. But today people don't think that way. I think they think more independently.
Well, yes, that may be a good thing, but still there has to be someone at the top making the decisions, I believe. And there has to be a system of a fair system of electing representatives and having people taking responsibility for their actions as well.
Mm.
And it is still, it might be difficult to have a institutional political society with authorities that are not based on a current democratic or elections or political system.
I agree.
Mm.
You mentioned the constitutionalism, Max, as a prerequisite for democracy. And it's very important that you have national agreement about what is the rules of the political game. I agree. But some problems like corruption, environment, and creation of new political movements sometimes work at a level above nation states. So I think we have a tendency of increasing European level forces that would like to have a stronger integration of European nations, for instance. That's what I believe is could be a possibility in 50 years from now, that we have a stronger European integration as a balance to, say, China and the US. Though I'm not sure that Red China exists in
50 years.
50 years. It can also change very rapidly there.
Mm. Yes, that's what I'm saying. I mean, things can change very rapidly. So can democracy.
I mean,
well, anyway, those who live will see what happens. You mentioned the United States. I just want to ask about that also, going back to the more practical aspects of this. This is arguably the only superpower in the world still, because of its cultural influence and all that, as well as the economic. And it's in for a political thriller this fall with a presidential election. So what about the United States? You hear a lot about the setbacks in the US as well. Has Donald Trump deteriorated democracy in the United States as you see it?
From an institutional or a basic formal way to see it, not very much. It's I believe you still could see that even though its rhetoric and some of its politics may be criticized, the institutional and the constitutional order of the United States is very much shown that it works. I would say.
What about you, Mikael? Do you see the same in the United States?
I hope you're right, Max.
I wouldn't. I couldn't. I am not an expert of the United States, but I believe.
But on your scale, it hasn't
fallen yet from the qualified to a weaker democracy.
I mean, we as always we will see. But I mean, let's say Trump loses, then we really hope he also leaves power, because if he does not, then we don't have a democracy any longer. Of course.
How would that even work?
Excuse me?
How would that even work? Him not leaving power?
I mean, he could say, well, I don't believe in this result, and make a campaign about some corruption in the election committees or whatever. I don't believe that, actually. But, I mean, that could indicate that something
that could be a threat, yes.
I mean, you never know when it comes to Trump.
No, that's true. That's very true.
What he does.
One have to see, but hopefully
I have kind of thought that he might get tired of being president if he doesn't have very broad support, if he sees that his numbers are going down. Of course, he can doctor the numbers a bit himself, but as the situation is now, his opinion, his numbers are not very good, actually. I think Biden is a bit
Biden is in the lead, yes.
Higher.
So far.
So far. how that is possible is also an enigma. But anyway, so we'll see what happens with democracy within the next 50 or 100 years, and your work is so important, I think, and
I really believe that. Looking at a 5 or 10 year perspective, the prediction is that it will. There is a trend that it's faded out the level of democracy in the world. And some countries are dropping, falling out, but there are also countries turning into democracies. And a wild guess is that the level of democracy will. I don't believe in the notion that authoritarianism will take a lead in the world.
No, I see. I think, as I mentioned before, I think populism is a kind of parasite on the democratic systems. So if we just invent the correct immunity system, we can handle that problem. It will take some years, but we will do that probably. Also, we have to think that we have to consider the fact that democracy on a world scale has been so immensely successful the last 100 years. So, I mean, it can be, maybe it was a bit too successful, which meant that countries that really didn't have all the sufficient conditions yet became democracies, but now under stronger conditions and harsh conditions actually fall back into electoral democracy or slight, democratic problems like Poland and Hungary.
And if I could add here, one of the most important criteria for not failing as a democracy is that you're a weak democracy compared to a qualified democracy. And since both we and others have identified that the number of qualified democracies are fewer and the number of weaker democracies are more, one can expect that more countries are at risk of failing as democracies. That is also, but that should be weighted to the fact that most countries that fail as democracies will in the next step return as democracies.
Is that what you have seen before?
That is what I've seen before, yes. And if we implement historical experiences to the future, I would.
So we shouldn't panic if we see a number of countries slipping down from qualified democracy to weaker democracy.
Panic is no good idea, but
never good.
No. Also, I think those countries that now have problems, if you take Poland, Hungary, and Ukraine, for instance, all of them have, in a longer perspective, have had either no real nation building or weak nation building or insufficient nation building. I mean, Poland for several years didn't exist. If you're going back 100 years and more, Hungary was dominated by Austria, and Ukraine was just part of Russia and didn't exist as a country. So, I mean, it takes time to fulfill Max's first criterion, control of the territory in a historical sense.
Yes.
I mean, to build up a nation as a structure without even considering democracy, just creating the infrastructure. So it takes a lot of time. I mean, compared to our country, which was, existed since
democracy was kind of evolving from an existing nation state in Sweden.
So what are the trends now then? The challenges and the trends, if you look like, I mean, I will stop talking about 50 to 100 years. Let's talk about what's going to happen within the next 10 years, say. What are the main trends and what are the challenges? And can you mention also maybe some regions where there is which are problematic and some regions that are can show us some hope for improvement?
Looking at regions, I would say that seen over the past decade or so, Africa is perhaps the most successful region. And even though one may not believe so. The number of democracies has strongly increased. And even qualified
about
democracies.
Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is it?
Africa as a total I include here.
Okay.
So you have Tunisia in mind.
And yes, those are included, I believe, in this. But Africa as a whole, sub-Saharan Africa too, has very much grown in democracy, even though there are setbacks as well. But where there are setbacks, like in Benin or you could see in Togo the past year, there are more good examples like Gambia and Sudan. So where there are setbacks, there are often positive examples too, and seen over the whole region. One can still see a positive development. Other regions have seen more setbacks in democracy, thanks to that, and the total level of democracy is the way it is. It's very much thanks to African development.
Okay.
And
so what other
Asia
regions
and,
have been problematic then?
Asia has seen some dropping in democracy.
Okay. All Asia or some parts of Asia? Southeast Asia?
Southeast Asia has seen some, like Thailand has seen a drop in democracy.
Oh, yeah. There was a military coup there,
Military coup, and Philippines has transferred from a qualified to a weak electoral democracy, but still a democracy, even though one have to see what happens there in the future.
So what about challenges?
Challenges, yes.
Thematic challenges or geographic challenges? You can choose which one.
One could see that there is a possible growth of populism and nationalism in the world as a whole, and that could be a challenge. Even though one may argue that the growth of nationalist party or populist party in itself could occur within the framework of democracy, only disturbing democracy, not being an actual factor degrading democracy. But when in power, there is a higher risk of degradation of democracy if there is a nationalist populist government. So one have to figure out different strategies to combat the growth of the populist and nationalist movement. And
is it naive to say that a population that is well informed and well educated will not stand for a very long time an authoritarian leader that tells them what to do? Is that naive? Mikael,
that is perhaps, it depends on how strong the authoritarianism system is.
Yeah,
I would say very much.
If the people is crushed underneath their boots, then
sometimes we have seen historically that popular movements have evolved around an authoritarian system, and then and that could, in some sense, strengthen the authoritarian system itself, even though it may have been a seed for a later democratic movement decades later.
Okay. I think
so. Perhaps, a well-educated and population maybe have greater possibilities to withstand an authoritarian system than populations that are maybe not that educated. But
I
believe it's have much to do with institutional or system or political climate.
Yes, and I would like to add, of course, free media and also the existence of parties. I have to stress the importance of parties, because if you have activism like the Arab Spring without any parties formed that then pursue the policies that everybody wants to be implemented, it really, it can change the leader from A to B, but in the longer run, it doesn't work if you don't have parties. So, and parties generally can take long time to create or form. In turn, stressing the importance of parliaments in which parties are formed and can compete. So it's very difficult to have a democracy if you don't have a real parliament in which real parties can be formed and compete for power. If you just have kind of a democratic movement without organization or power parties or parliament, it's almost, in vain. It will just dissipate. It has no future. So it's like Sweden in the, say, 1855, when we had riots because of famine and so on, but we had no parties, we had no real parliament yet, and we had no organization that could accumulate interest and make them into possible policies that could be implemented by winning election as a party, and so on and so forth.
Channel these interests to
yeah,
the
exactly.
level of power.
That's extremely important. Also, that was a problem for, say, Ukraine, because they won independence just like that, suddenly, as the Soviet Union simply disappeared. They got independence, but they didn't have real parties. And without parties, they could not foster or breed trustworthy leaders that would actually pursue the policies people wanted. And therefore, you have a very weak democracy. Compare that to Poland, where Solidarność actually could transfer those opinions into proper policies, and they could win election. Actually, it was a landslide election in '89, and that was more successful. And then they had a lot of very small parties that eventually became a few more or less working parties. But it took several decades to form a party system within a parliament. So that process takes time. So it means that
you still believe the parties will be there to foment the system for years to come, for the foreseeable future. So you can't see any other kind of organization for this. I guess Egypt is a very strong case in point, as you mentioned, because everyone was happy when there were demonstrations in the streets, and this had never happened before there. And we all know what happened after that. LCC took power. So we'll see. But I think, personally, I think that what happened in Egypt wasn't in vain. And I've also talked to people from Egypt who have the same view. That, I mean, there is something happened in the population that created some kind of momentum, and it's still there. It's simmering below. I mean, underneath the surface in some way. So someday something's going to happen, and maybe, as you say,
hopefully, yes.
Yeah, hopefully, what's going to happen is perhaps that a new kind of party system is going to mushroom. I don't know, but something.
Still, Egypt has compared to today with the Mubarak era. Egypt has a more pluralistic party system still, even though most of them are loyal to Sisi. Perhaps there is a possibility for some of them to form the foundation of a more democratic system ahead.
So on your scale, is Egypt higher now than it was during Mubarak? Or is it the same?
At this moment, it's the same, I would say.
It's the same, okay. Well, that's what most people say.
Simply looking at the parliamentary structure, it is have better conditions than during the Mubarak.
Okay.
But,
yes. So there was a seed. The seed was sown.
Yes, and hopefully it's still here. For a future development, but one will see.
Let's hope. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to add anything in that area, Mikael?
No, I just wanted to mention that Max's dataset makes it possible to analyze the detailed fabric of regimes in the world during huge periods of time in a way that is unprecedented. So, I mean, you can really use, say, data mining techniques, or you can use other perspectives on world development, because you can focus not only on country cases and which systems they have there, you can focus on the institutions. You can study different types of democracies and see which ones are the most successful and least successful, and then discuss sequences so that you can advise which type of democracy would be the best one for each country in a certain moment in time. So, I mean, there are tremendous opportunities for a lot of research on his data, really. So it's really...
That's a very good point. This is a truly unique data set, max range.
Yeah.
And hopefully it's going to spread more among researchers and media also, perhaps. So finally, if you just can tell us a little bit about where you're heading with your research and your data set now, the next steps here, what's going to happen with these enormous amounts of data?
What do you say, Mikael?
Yeah, I'm working actually on several papers. I have one paper now on post-Soviet regimes, which type they selected, and this will be part of a volume on post-Soviet political regimes for a book on American publishing house. I'm also working on a paper in which I try to find out the pioneers of certain regimes so that you can see which ones are actually imitated later on. So you can distinguish between the original innovators of regimes and then the following adoptions of similar systems, because it's interesting to see that democracies often differ. I mean, the typical differences between presidential systems and parliamentary systems, and how, in what sequences do they normally evolve? I mean, if you have one pre-democratic parliamentary system, does that mean that you will eventually be able to implement a parliamentary democracy, or can you change into a presidential system? And what are the factors behind different later possible regime types of countries? So it's an amazing set of questions possible to answer with that type of a multi-dimensional data set.
Yes, really, truly.
Yeah. So as I said, it's possible to use it for very complex analysis, but also for very country-specific predictions of certain probabilities. So it's really useful for several purposes, both for theoretical analysis and for practical use.
A scientific goldmine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and Max, you keep it up.
I keep it up. Updating the data for contemporary events
on a monthly basis.
On a monthly basis, and evolving new variables and to expand the data both in the length and in the width. Right.
Impressive.
So there's always new things to do.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Keep it up. Keep up your good work, both of you, and thank you very much for talking to me on Mind the Shift this afternoon. We're recording this mid-July 2020. So thanks again, and goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.